Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 1, New France and British North America, 1713 to 1800. This is Lesson number 12. How did the Loyalist migration impact British North America's population? I just want to direct your attention for a minute to this picture here. It's a picture of one of many statues depicting Loyalist families, which can be found throughout Canada. And it might be interesting to take some time to consider whether you've seen a statue similar to this before. I may not have known at the time what exactly that statue represented. And keep in mind when you're out on your travels in the future, take a look and see if you see a statue such as this one here. Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. How would the arrival of the Loyalists have affected the people already living in British North America? By that I mean the First Nations, the Canadians, and the Acadians who had managed to find refuge in New France. So put the video on pause and consider this question, jot down your ideas, and then you can hit play again. All right, now let's proceed. The Loyalist migration had a serious impact on the First Nations. Ever since first contact with the Europeans, the First Nations had been forced to partner with British or French colonizers in order to survive. Although they never surrendered their independence, the native peoples had to make alliances in order to keep up the peace and hold on to as much power over their lives as possible. Now that the British had complete control of the Maritimes, they wanted to establish more peaceful relations with the First Nations. Peace and friendship treaties were signed with the Micmac, Malecite, and Passamaquoddy tribes. Although the Micmac were now British allies, the massive growth in the Loyalist population resulted in settlers taking over First Nations land. Between 1783 and 1812, a number of land surrender treaties were signed in which the First Nations agreed to turn over their land to the British. However, the treaty process was often hurried and unfair. Sometimes the British gave verbal promises to the First Nations instead of a written document. The First Nations actually preferred this since they held on to their oral traditions. The problem was the British government did not honor their spoken promises, and there were no written documents to prove that the British had made these promises. As a result of the growing Loyalist population and unfair treaties, the Micmac population declined significantly. The Loyalist migration had an equally serious impact on the First Nations. There were over 8,000 Loyalists living in Quebec, and they were not pleased with their new homes. The majority of the population was Canadian, and Quebec was still governed by the Quebec Act. This meant that the majority spoke French, followed French civil law, and followed Catholic traditions. As more Loyalists moved into the area, political tensions grew between the Loyalists and the Canadiens. The Loyalists wanted to be able to buy and own their land, which was not allowed under the seigneurial system. They began building Protestant churches and schools, which angered the Canadiens. The Loyalists also wanted a British-style House of Assembly in which certain positions, like the Governor-General, were appointed and other positions were elected. The Canadiens also wanted political change. They demanded their own assembly that was entirely elected. In order to keep the peace, the British government established new Loyalist settlements beyond the Ottawa Valley. The creation of the Eastern Townships began the division of Quebec along English-French lines. The French government then passed the Constitutional Act 1791, which divided Quebec into two colonies, Upper Canada and Lower Canada, as you can see on this map. Now, something to keep in mind going forward with future lessons, I will at times be referring to British North America, which will include much more than Upper and Lower Canada. British North America will continue to be a term which I will use to refer to all of the British controlled lands in North America. But you're going to notice on upcoming lessons I'll be talking about the Canadas, and that's not a giant mistake on my part. When I refer to the Canadas, what I'm referring to are Upper Canada and Lower Canada. So with that in mind, each colony would have its own elected assembly, but would be led by appointed officials from Britain. The British majority in Upper Canada would have its Protestant churches and schools, British laws, and could own its land. The Canadians in Lower Canada were able to keep their French language, religion, and seigneurial land use system. The Loyalists' arrival also affected how geographic borders were drawn in the Maritime region. Many Maritime Loyalists did not trust the existing settlers in Nova Scotia since they had remained neutral during the American Revolution. The Maritime Loyalists demanded that they be given their own settlements. This resulted in Nova Scotia being divided into three separate colonies: a New Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Cape Breton Island. The area's remaining 8,500 Acadians were spread across these colonies. All right, so we're in the wrap up now, and let's finish today's lesson by considering the following. Number one, can you think of any advantages or disadvantages of splitting Quebec into Upper Canada and Lower Canada? And two, do you think the Loyalist migration helped to improve the lives of the people already living in British North America? So I want you to do at home is to put the video on pause so that you can consider and then write down your responses to these two questions. If you don't feel prepared to do this, then you need to go back and watch this video at least 2 more times and then put the video on pause. And I look forward to hearing everybody's responses in our next class. But until then, this concludes today's video.